our next guest, we're going to go outside the box. I know it's a cliche, but we're clearly going outside the box. We're eventually going to get around to politics, I think, but we're not going to start with politics, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on politics. We're going to spend a lot of time on, I guess, something I'm going to call Imagineering, among other things. We used to love going to Disney World, Disneyland, and they prided themselves on Imagineering. They were looking into the future. They were inventing. They were creative. And that's who I think my next guest is. It's Alexa Clay. She is the author of The Misfit Economy, but she is also, and again, I have to read this, I apologize, I love this. She's the founder of Wisdom Hackers. I love that, Wisdom Hackers. And she's the co-founder of the League of Intrapreneurs. So if that doesn't evoke visions of Imagineering to you, I don't think anything else will. So we're going to be on an adventure today, and I think we're going to have some fun.
Great, thanks for having me.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So I always tell my guests the first question, and you got your first question about 30 seconds ago. And I said we're going to do this dreaded interview question. Where do you see yourself in 5 years or 10 years? You can actually pick the timeline, but you're the Imagineer, you know. So where will you be, and where will the world be in your world?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's the sort of question my parents would ask, and I would really have no idea. But I think more where will the world be in 5 or 10 years is something that I'm more interested in. Okay. And I think I tend to, all the things that I've done so far in my life, I haven't engineered any of them. You know, they've really been these things that have come into my life that I get interested in a particular culture and have to go exploring it. So one thing that I'm going off exploring right now is the strange subculture of LARP, or live action role playing, which, you know, used to just be this idea of nerds running around in the woods with swords, but I think is actually really interesting for thinking about this idea of Imagineering and how do you create new types of cultures. I think so many of us are born into these cultures that we feel like we can't transform or we can't hack. And so I've become really fascinated with people that can prototype new types of cultures. And I think being able to create games or experiences where you can temporarily live in some of these realities and understand, you know, what would a world be like without money? Or what would the future of relationships look like? Or you were joking about Mars earlier, but what would a space colony on Mars look like? And these can all be things that we design. So I think certainly in 5 years, I want to get much more experimental in terms of embodying some of the different types of fringe cultures and misfit cultures that might be part of our future that could potentially exist in 100 years, and begin bringing those into the present moment.
How did you get attracted to this? Is it a field? What do we call this?
I'm really interested in subculture. So both my parents started as anthropologists. Okay. My mom researched alien abduction for a period of time. Okay. My father worked with indigenous communities in the Amazon, working on fair trade type of markets. So I think I always bring an anthropological perspective into anything that I do, whether that's going into a Fortune 500 company and finding that environment extremely bizarre and wanting to you know, understand the corporate heart of darkness, or you know, working with subcultures that are hacker collectives or LARPing communities or the Amish, and understanding some of the logic and rationalities at play there and how we can learn from them.
And at some point, for instance, when you're writing a book, do you try to tie it together and make sense of it, or do you just try and go with it? And
yeah, I mean, well, so let's take the Misfit Economy. There was a very specific idea here. I'd spent a lot of time looking at grassroots innovation amongst social entrepreneurs, so people that were building out good businesses. I spent a lot of time working with misfits within huge organizations and bureaucracies that were trying to hack those cultures from the inside. And then I said, you know, I really want to spend time working with fringe economies and documenting the practices of hackers and pirates and anyone who's part of the black market or underground economy, and understanding how they're innovative. So really going after the unusual suspects in that way.
And then is the goal to take that and then bring it to other places as a teaching tool, so to speak?
Yeah, I think one of the goals is empathy. So they're amazing entrepreneurs that happen to be, you know, drug dealers or happen to exist in our prison populations. And so how do we look at their entrepreneurial hustle and the ways in which they build businesses and actually give them a shot in the formal economy? So many of the folks that were forced into the black markets did so because of limited economic opportunity. So I think there's a huge learning that we can do as a society around some of the skills and assets that a lot of these marginalized communities of criminals actually have, and how do we plug them into this huge trend right now around entrepreneurship in Silicon Valley. And also, how do we transform the whole discourse around Silicon Valley? How do we think beyond the sort of Mark Zuckerberg types of innovators in the world and actually look at street level innovators and grassroots innovators and criminal innovators and bring them into economic opportunity?
So you had an idea for a book.
Yeah.
And how long, and I have to assume you had a lot of fun researching this book,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You traveled all over the world.
Yeah.
Really? So how did you get the idea for the book, and then how did you go about putting the book together?
The book really started as a joke, a bad joke in a way, and you might want to cut this out. But it was basically this joke of a terrorist group approaching McKinsey, a consulting firm, to offset the carbon emissions of a bombing. And so it became this way of examining what about people that we turn into others, that we don't see any of their humanity, groups like ISIS? How do we actually begin to understand how they manage organizations, how they do financing, how they might have, even environmental concerns? And so really wanting to actually probe into some of these cultures and understand them and not just dismiss them as evil or as different. And so from there, just started, what started off as more just an inquiry became a huge field and body of research of, going to China and India and speaking to IP pirates or folks that would knock off, copycat products, speaking to gangsters in New York, going underground with hacker collectives in Berlin and Paris. And it really just spiraled from there. The more folks that I spoke to, the more people had introductions for a different type of community.
Did you have a fascination with pirates going in, or did you develop that when you were?
I always had a fascination with misfits growing up.
Okay.
So I definitely had a love of pirates and the outlaw kind of mindset as a child. And I grew up also near Walden Pond, near Cambridge, Mass. So Henry Thoreau, was a hermit there and wrote a lot of his great transcendental philosophy. And I loved, he tried to live this very alternative kind of life. And so those types of stories, Joan of Arc, or, these stories always really intrigued me. And yeah, I guess in a way it was just like a childhood fantasy come true of being able to go out and speak to some of these people.
Now, on this show, we talk about the fact that the political system is totally dysfunctional.
Yeah.
Yeah, when you talk about pirates, you say they essentially had this amazing democratic society. It also almost seemed like socialism to a certain extent, right?
Yeah. There's a lot of...
How did that exist? How did that come about?
Well, there's a lot of ruthlessness to piracy for sure. But at the same time, what we discovered was, pirates created democracies before democracies existed in Western Europe. They created constitutions to govern their ships. And a lot of the early pirates were really escaping the old command and control merchant vessels. And so they wanted more egalitarian systems to govern those vessels. And so that became really an interesting way of actually, you say socialism. There were a lot of collectivist types of egalitarian ideas aboard these ships. And that was something that we found, to this day in a lot of these informal economies. There were, I wouldn't call them socialists, but certainly more communitarian ideals at work in how communities sought to organize themselves. Anonymous, for example, the hacker collective not having one particular leader, but being very decentralized as an organization. In slums around the world, you have gift economy principles that are often applied. So it really was a different kind of economics and a different kind of economy.
And I know you said before, you may want to cut it out, but talking about ISIS or whatever, the reality is, society doesn't receive it well, and I'm not condoning it, but there can be brilliant criminal minds.
Yeah.
Right?
100.
I mean, this is what they do. They're criminals, but they happen to become brilliant criminals, and they think of ways to exist that other people may not, but when you look at it, it can make sense within that context. So how do you migrate some of these thoughts to other scenarios? Like big corporations. You mentioned the gentleman at Ford.
Yep.
He was kind of an outlier, misfit within Ford, but he actually managed to exist there too.
Yeah, I think it's all about learning how to game the system. And you talk about our political systems being flawed. Well, so many of our corporate systems and bureaucracies are deeply flawed and hijacked by, financial interests that are very short-termist. So one sort of subset of the misfit population that I was really interested in was this idea of the insider misfit, the sort of person that has to camouflage themselves within an institution and tries to bring a radically different type of agenda. And David Burdish was one of these types of guys at Ford. He was a third generation auto worker. His grandfather was a huge labor activist who was actually beaten by Ford's henchmen back in the day, and yet he continued to have loyalty to Ford for his entire life. And his grandson also worked at Ford, but came in with a very different spirit. He didn't sort of put on the uniform and conform to his job description, but he wanted the company to develop better human rights practices. He wanted the company to think about existing beyond just automobile manufacturing, so how they could be part of urban transport solutions and mobility and more sustainable fuel and these types of things.
Do you find that many bureaucracies are trying to adapt to that strategy of allowing the misfit, as you call it, to exist, to kind of always be whispering in their ear or at least pushing them enough? Or is that a new phenomenon?
I think it's new. I think we used to live in a capitalism where people would maybe have one or two jobs for life, and they were really these command and control organizations that were built around factory principles. And I think more and more work is evolving beyond those factory principles, that self-discipline and organization isn't as much prized, because these organizations have to evolve. The death rate for companies is crazy. So many are going extinct, and they have to evolve into a different type of new economy. And so I think the more that they can be receptive to misfits or to entrepreneurs or to really just an entrepreneurial spirit that a lot of the founders of these huge bureaucracies had, I think that's incredibly powerful. But it's an awkward choreography. It's a strange dance. Companies don't really know how to do this. Governments don't really know how to do this yet.
No, governments don't know how to do it all. In fact, I want to finish the book, but so we're going to talk some politics today. It seems to me that the overregulation of business is a very hot topic right now. But overregulating is almost, to me, a reaction of saying we don't want misfits. In other words, the more you overregulate and you don't allow the exception, your camel milk, so to speak. So how do we break through that? How do we have a system that's overregulated and have that system recognize the value of a misfit? By the way, I don't know how much you thought about using the word misfit. It's almost too negative for me.
I think it depends who you speak to. I think, my mother's first response is, why would you write a book about weirdos or, these sort of outliers? But for me, it was actually more of a celebratory identity. Mm-hmm. And I think for a lot of young people who don't necessarily feel like they can conform into the systems or the societies that they, are raised in, it can be, a really powerful identity. And it's one that,
So it is a term of endearment.
It definitely is a term of endearment, yeah.
Okay, but again, we have this overregulation, and then we have these misfits that you call them, but they're creative people, if not creating by necessity, they're creating. And again, you have the example of the Amish farmer and the other gentleman who want to bring camel milk.
Yeah.
But the system won't allow it.
Right. Yeah, and
so what do you do when there's this clash of your misfits?
Well, I think you've
system?
always had this clash between the state and these fringe economies, and particular informal economies who don't want to be overseen by the state. I brought moonshine over for you, which is a fun example, right, of this sort of classic conflict.
Straight out of the garage?
Yeah, this is you can have a sip. It's quite early, but it's from East Tennessee. It's called Sugarland's.
We're doing an ad for Sugarland's sign here today, guys.
Yeah.
Y'all come down and get some.
I don't know if they have it in Aspen yet, but they made in 2009, Tennessee actually legalized moonshine as a way of getting revenue, but also as a way of ensuring greater product quality. And so it was historic moonshiners who were really some of the first NASCAR racers, because they had to build souped up engines to outrace the police. Mm-hmm. They had all these amazing ways of staying one step above the law. And for Amish farmers across the U.S. who are making camel milk, it's a similar kind of thing. They're selling camel milk through buyers clubs as a way of getting around regulations. Buyers clubs are similar to how HIV and AIDS medications.
Like the movie.
Dallas Buyers Club, exactly. And so I think you do have these workarounds, but I think the point is really not around regulation. I think government shouldn't just be a lagging kind of thing to out-regulate these markets, but it should be around license to operate. So, huge companies violate the law all the time, but they'll either just, lobby to create the legislation that they want, or, they'll pay a fee when they've broken that law. And so I think my vision would be much more people-centered markets, citizen-centered markets. I think whether companies should exist or not should be a democratic question. People should decide whether or not Camel Milk should exist, whether or not moonshine should exist.
So how would you do that?
I think it's through a license to operate. I think if with financial companies, for example, if there's serious outrage around the behavior of some of these financial institutions, we have to start creating alternatives. We have to put pressure on governments to regulate those companies differently. And we basically have to create, have enough moral courage and the ability to sort of provoke these systems and the ability to challenge them.
So how do you do that in the context of our political system, though? How do you find a champion that's willing to take on a misfit? Because we live in the world of everything's negative in politics.
Yeah.
So if someone's seen as grasping the misfit world, they're going to be ostracized. How do we leapfrog that and make people understand that there's the value?
It's knowing the right time to politicize, I suppose. So for me, I think a lot of change can come from grassroots community and civic innovation. And I would for elections, for example, all these candidates are spending so much money getting people to vote. And voting is just the easiest form of agency. It's the most sort of minute in a way. Like, you have all this potential as a human being to contribute to your country, and the one thing that the elected official is asking you to do is outsource your agency to them through voting. And so, I don't know, I would prefer an alternative type of political campaign even, where you have candidates actually doing things in the communities, where you don't just knock on people's doors and get someone to vote for a particular ballot or a type of measure, but you actually do community work, where you have standing infrastructure for citizens to make their communities better, and not necessarily, outsource all of their power to elected officials and to government.
Now, you actually have a chapter that I think could be a book in and of itself, and it goes back to government and dysfunction, etc. It's this notion of copying. Mm. And you've got some very insightful works that you're talking about, that talk about, and again, we're saying that people see patented products, right, or they see products other people have produced. What right do they have to take them and copy them or improve on them? Now, you give one example in your book, I think, where someone in China took someone's product exactly the way it was. They didn't try to change anything other than maybe calling it something different. That's at one extreme. But then a lot of things you talk about in your book are people are genuinely improving a product, yet the legal system doesn't want to allow that. So I thought it was a fascinating conversation.
Yeah, I think this whole idea of whether the morality of copying, right? So, big companies have patent protections that enable them to, really undermine sort of small little guy inventors. And one of the earliest things that I learned doing research around this idea of copying was that the U.S. industrial history owed to its own sort of generation of patent robbers, that the U.S. took all these patents from Western Europe and commercialized them illegally, and that was a huge impetus to the growth in the U.S. economy in the 19th century. And so now it's a little bit ironic that we're going overseas and U.S. companies are forcing, people in Brazil and China and India to conform to patent regimes, when it's not part of our own history of development or how we achieved, progress. And so
a couple hundred years later, you forget.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's convenient. Once you're winning the game, you kind of forget how you got there.
How does the rest of the world view it? Are we at one extreme here?
I think definitely the West is in one extreme. It's interesting because as Chinese companies are maturing now, where they have some of their own IP at risk, they're becoming a little bit more protective. But in China, private property isn't the same concept. That doesn't really exist. You also have, in Brazil and India, it was really interesting to speak to IP patent robbers who are kind of Robin Hood-like characters. They're stealing patents from healthcare companies and developing imitation drugs that are much more affordable and accessible for the poor and for local markets. And in a lot of these countries, the poor can't afford the Western drugs. So in that way, there's really a moral crusade to enable this kind of copying.
Yeah, it's a huge problem in the United States. We have a very expensive healthcare system, right? and the drugs are very expensive.
Yeah.
I know there's this expensive hepatitis C drug right now. I can't think of the technical name for it. Well, the treatment in the United States is somewhere between $50,000 and $80,000 a person. In India, it's $800 a person.
Yeah.
How do you reconcile that? You know?
Yeah.
But it comes back to this regulation of copying, among other things, and trademark, patent, etc. But at some point, you would think the misfit economy wins that battle.
I think the misfit economy is winning that battle, and I think I think part of the logic of the pharmaceutical or healthcare companies is to say we need these patents so that the amount of money we invested in R&D can come back to us. But the way these companies are doing R&D is not through copying principles that would actually be more efficient. So if pharmaceutical companies, for example, did more joint or collaborative or pre-competitive efforts to explore, drug discovery, that would be amazing and a time saver and a money saver, in pooling some of these investments.
I think you mentioned in your book, even if they just let other people know what their failures were,
exactly,
that would be a
yeah,
great thing.
The fact that if you're a company working on developing a molecule and I've figured out 10 years ago it's not going to have any kind of impact or lead to a breakthrough, my competitive advantage is allowing me to keep that information from you. Meanwhile, you can be investing millions and millions of dollars in this.
Kind of convoluted thinking, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I told you I'm going to try and push you a little bit on politics.
Okay.
Why don't we have the misfit political thing going on here? It's so stunning to me that the system can be that dysfunctional, and people aren't misfitting their way into correcting it.
You have the Pirate Party, which is kind of a joke party.
I have to look them up.
Okay, yeah, they exist in Germany and in Sweden, and it's all around access to information.
You should be the head of the Pirate Party, I think.
Well, I to be honest, in 5-10 years, I think it would be really interesting to create a new political party in the U.S. And I think that would
I want to do it sooner than that.
Yeah? I think you need to first build all the infrastructure for citizens to contribute more. I think I don't want to create a political party that's just dependent on like a sort of hero on a white horse, but is actually, because we've built infrastructure around the country where people are contributing local to communities and understand the issues that are affecting them. And so, I don't know, it's just when is the right time to politicize? What would your political party be based on? What would be?
Well, I'm going to give you my book after today's interview, and then we'll talk about that another. But my viewers have been bored to death already with my book.
Okay.
So let's move on to a couple other aspects of your life before we run out of time. You have this, you are the founder of Wisdom Hackers. Yeah. I love the name. What's a wisdom hacker?
So this is a community. I really don't start businesses. I create communities in a lot of the work that I do. And so one of my most influential teachers growing up was a philosophy professor who came into our high school, public high school, and just started teaching 14-year-olds Socratic philosophy. Okay. And he'd take us into the mountains of West Virginia, and it was just an extraordinary gift. It's something
Teachers get in trouble for doing that stuff now.
I know, because he was a total misfit, and now you have all these regulations that would prevent something like that from happening. But it was just one of the most empowering experiences of my life, and gave me this ability to really have philosophical conversations with anyone. And that's basically what I do, is go around the world and talk to people around their values and their philosophies and how they think about life. And so I wanted to create a community that, in an age where we're so we have this attention deficit disorder almost collectively because of the ways we engage with digital technology, because of the fact that everyone is working so hard and has time poverty. How do we create
time poverty? What a great phrase.
Yeah, it's it's huge. And so how do we create space for this type of reflection? How do we create space for the most burning things that we're thinking about? If you're thinking about this political party, how would you? I guess you've created space through this television show and other avenues to do that. But so many people have these questions that they just don't have time or space to answer. So Wisdom Hackers is an effort to create communities around those types of questions, where you have a self-directed learning community where people provide peer support to one another around some of the most burning questions that they're holding.
And then do they publish or somehow communicate the results of the efforts?
Yeah, we encourage them to really, for the question not to be an academic exercise, but for them to talk to people in the real world, to talk to strangers. And then the result is often what we called a dispatch, which is a long-form essay on the topic. But people have also made videos or done dances or done audio clips and done little films, all to help create an artifact around that type of experience.
Fascinating. So if our viewers want to
Wisdomhackers.com. Yeah, definitely.
Wisdomhackers.com.
Yeah, and we run salons. We're running salons around the world where people can host discussions around different topics.
All right. And then there's the League of Intrapreneurs.
Yeah. So this work started for me 7 years ago, really working with misfits within huge companies. And that was another community, that I formed, a bit like Alcoholics Anonymous or something for these rebel types. Because if you're in a huge organization and you're trying to create change, you're so alone, and it's really hard to stay resilient, to stay emotionally sane, and to continue to push against the grain of that organization. So this was just a way of creating space for people to come together, to strategize almost in a Game of Thrones-like way around how they could bring more of these disruptive ideas into their work.
Is one of the threshold questions, though, for these people, should I stay or go?
I think.
And do you have that conversation with them?
We have it all the time, and it is like a therapy conversation, because I think so many of these agents realize that they have incredible scale and influence within these organizations that they wouldn't have if they were just a solo entrepreneur, if they jump ship. But finding the right culture where you feel like where your values aren't being co-opted by a brand, where you feel like you can actually make the type of traction and change that you're looking for, is really difficult. So a lot of them do, jump to other types of things or spin out. And that's a question we constantly have to have with people. Is this a ripe space? Is this a right footing for you to create the type of change that you want to see in the world?
And same thing, how do we find?
Oh, leagueofintrapreneurs.com, socentleague.com.
And it's intra, I-N-T-R-A,
yes,
preneurs.
Yeah.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah.
Well, I love that conversation, and I hope the Aspen Institute invites you back next year, because I'm going to communicate with you, and then we're going to get even more political next year.
Okay, great.
And in fact, by then you will have had the hackers and entrepreneurs trying to figure out solutions.
By then we can create the new political party, and then we'll know what we're doing in 5 years.
How fun.
That sounds great.
All right, thank you so much for your time, and all the best with your book.
Cool, thanks.